Have you ever thought about how different your life would be if you had been born just a few miles away? Imagine that, by a random twist of fate, you came into the world in another country, speaking another language, shaped by another culture. But despite all of that, would you still be you? Borders are nothing more than invisible lines drawn on maps, yet they dictate our lives in profound ways. They decide where we can be, who we can become, and more often than not, they determine our fate. But do these barriers really make sense? Are they natural, or just a human-made illusion to divide what was never meant to be separated? Today, there are over 281 million migrants worldwide, according to the United Nations. People crossing borders in search of a new life, facing obstacles that often seem completely arbitrary. But if the world has always been in motion, why do some now have the right to decide who can enter and who must stay out? This question leads us to an existential dilemma. What truly defines us? If we're all just cosmic dust floating through space, why do we cling so tightly to the idea of belonging? In this video, we'll explore what science, optimistic nihilism, and history have to say about the illusion of the other and what it reveals about our own nature. Borders seem like natural things, like rivers or mountains, but in reality, they are human inventions, drawn and redrawn throughout history to serve those in power. If we look back far enough, we'll see that the idea of fixed territories is actually very recent. For most of human history, people migrated freely, without passports or restrictions. In the ancient world, great empires like the Roman and Persian expanded without setting rigid borders. Cities were open and welcomed different cultures. Even massive walls, like the Great Wall of China, were not just defensive barriers, but symbols of power. They marked dominance, but they didn't completely stop movement. The modern concept of nations and citizenship emerged around the 17th century with the Treaty of Westphalia. That was when the idea of sovereign states became dominant. Before that, where you lived wasn't as important as who you belonged to, whether it was a kingdom, a tribe, or a culture. People moved as they needed to, without governments deciding if they were allowed to enter. If history shows us that humans have always been nomadic, why do we now cling so tightly to the idea of belonging to a specific piece of land? Does it really make sense to stop people from crossing lines that, at the end of the day, are just imaginary? If borders were created by humans, where does this need for separation come from? Why, throughout history, have some people always tried to define who belongs and who should be excluded? The answer might lie inside our own brains. For millions of years, the human brain has been wired to distinguish between us and them. This instinct was a survival mechanism. In ancient times, trusting only your own group increased your chances of staying alive. Strangers could mean danger, competition for resources, or a threat to stability. Even today, this programming still exists. A study from Princeton University found that the human brain reacts differently when seeing faces of people from different ethnic backgrounds. Before we even think rationally, our brains activate regions linked to vigilance and fear. But here's the paradox: the brain is also highly adaptable. Over time, with exposure, this reaction fades, and the other is no longer perceived as a threat. This means that our tendency to separate ourselves from others isn't an unchangeable reality. It's an illusion we can overcome. If our instinct to divide once served a purpose, does it still make sense today? In a world where technology, instant communication, and globalization have made societies more interconnected than ever, why do we still act as if outsiders are dangerous? Biology shaped us, but it doesn't define us. If everything is transient and evolving, maybe it's time to let go of this outdated mental program. If the fear of the other has biological roots, the concept of a nation is an even more recent and artificial phenomenon. Today, we are taught to believe that we belong to a country, that our identity is tied to a flag. But does this separation really make sense, or is it just another collective illusion? The idea of the modern nation-state only emerged in the 17th century with the Treaty of Westphalia. Before that, the world was made up of kingdoms, empires, and tribes, without the rigid borders we know today. The concept of a closed-off territory, controlled by a central government, was a political invention, a way to organize power and decide who was inside and who was outside. Historian Benedict Anderson called nations imagined communities. According to him, a nation is not a physical reality. It is something we construct through symbols, shared myths, and collective storytelling. This means that national identity is, to a large extent, a well-crafted fiction. So if nations are just agreements, why do we take them so seriously? Why do we allow them to dictate who can cross a border and who cannot? In the end, the idea of belonging is as fragile as the borders we have drawn. So why do we keep treating them as if they were absolute truths? If the idea of a nation is a social construct, then how do we decide who belongs and who doesn't? Who has the right to cross a border and who is denied entry? The paradox of national identity is that it constantly evolves, yet we treat it as something permanent. In the United States, for example, the definition of who is considered American has changed multiple times throughout history. In the early 20th century, Irish and Italian immigrants were seen as threats to the nation's identity. Today, they are fully integrated into American culture. In Brazil, a country built on waves of immigration, there are still contradictions when it comes to accepting new groups, as if there were a standard for belonging. But who decides that? The truth is, belonging has never been about geography. It's about power. Those in control determine who is welcome and who is excluded. But if we look at the facts, this exclusion makes little sense. A 2020 Harvard University study found that more diverse societies tend to be more innovative and economically dynamic. Identity is not a wall, it's a river in constant motion. Trying to define it rigidly is like trying to hold water in your hands. If we know that everything changes, then why do we keep trying to stop the other from becoming part of something that was never fixed to begin with? If we look at history, we'll see that borders have always changed. Empires have risen and fallen, nations have been redrawn, and populations have mixed. But in the future, will borders continue to exist? Or are we moving toward a world where they no longer make sense? With globalization, national barriers are becoming increasingly symbolic. Companies operate across multiple countries, cultures blend through the internet, and people live in places they've never even physically visited. Technology is erasing borders faster than governments can reinforce them. But there's a much bigger problem ahead: climate change. According to the United Nations, by 2050, nearly 200 million people will be forced to migrate due to environmental disasters. Rising sea levels, droughts, and resource shortages will make it impossible for many to stay where they are. And when survival is at stake, political borders will no longer matter. The world is changing, and with it our idea of identity and belonging. If borders have always been temporary, maybe it's time to consider a different model. Or will we continue clinging to the illusion of the other until it's too late? Let's go back to our first question. What if you had been born on the other side of the border? Would you still be the same person? If nothing in life has a fixed meaning, why do we hold on so tightly to the idea that some people belong while others do not? Borders are illusions we create to feel in control, but in reality, no one truly belongs anywhere. History shows us that everything changes: cultures, identities, nations. And science proves that the separation between us and them is just an outdated instinct wired into our brains. Optimistic nihilism teaches us that if everything is temporary, we get to decide how to interpret the world. If borders are human-made, we can choose whether to reinforce them or let them fade away. In the end, maybe true freedom is realizing that there is no other, just human beings sharing the same tiny speck of cosmic dust. And now, I leave you with a question. If none of this were a social construct, how would you see the world? Let me know in the comments.